Hello, this is Ed Rothstein, Carroll County Commissioner, and you're tuned in to the Conduit Street Podcast, your go-to source for understanding how Maryland's policies impact your daily life.
Hello and welcome back to the Conduit Street Podcast. This is Michael Sanderson, director here at MACO. Happy to host our episode today, and I've got a little setup for you to explain our guest and the topic I want to get into for today's episode. So, not too long ago, I had an opportunity to go to the governor's reception room in the State House with a lot of big hitters and dignitaries for the 2025 Maryland Sustainable Growth Awards. This is sort of a long-running program where Maryland honors leaders and programs and local jurisdictions who have stepped up and contributed toward our overall plan for sustainability and smart development plans and so forth. We're thinking about our roles as stewards of the environment, looking at the Chesapeake Bay, looking at our surrounding areas and thinking about sustainability and so forth. It's always a good event, and I love that we spotlight local programs that are doing well. At those awards, I heard a presentation on Award 2 and discussion about a person who's been doing years of work in the Chesapeake Bay watershed and doing data collection and interesting science, and I came away with a sense, this sounds really interesting. I'd love to get him onto our podcast. So lucky for us, we've got enough of you out there, listeners, to make us a big enough deal that we've got Peter Claggett, a research geographer with the U.S. Geological Survey and also with the Chesapeake Bay Program. He's our guest on today's episode, and I want to talk about the work he's done. So, Peter, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Michael.
Well, I'm delighted to have you here, and I'm hoping I can lead you into a little bit of the flavor of the stuff that basically earned you the Sustainable Growth Award for this year as a recipient, but also kind of the big picture of work that you and your team have been doing in the Chesapeake Bay watershed in this area. Kind of walk us through the nuts and bolts, and I think our listeners will join me in seeing why this seemed like a good and interesting topic.
Sure. Well, I've worked for the U.S. Geological Survey for the past 22 years. And over my entire career with the survey, it's basically been about characterizing the landscape, what it looks like from the terrain, the topography, to the land cover, whether it's tree canopy or impervious, to the land use, whether it's residential, commercial, agricultural, characterizing the landscape today, characterizing the landscape back through time, and then using that information to inform models to forecast what the condition of the landscape is going to look like in the future. And that's basically been kind of the vision from the get-go, and it's iterated over time over the last 2 decades based on technology, new satellites, available techniques have changed. But the essence of what we do, myself and my team and the partner organizations that I work with, has more or less kind of been the same. And it's motivated by the notion that, hindsight is 20/20. Mm-hmm. If we can look back today, 20, 30, 40 years ago, and say, what if we took a different trajectory? What if we did this instead of that? What if we developed differently? What if we planned for more parks or more open space, or didn't put the school 30 miles away from where people live? If we did that differently, and made different choices in the past, then the present, we would benefit from that in the present. And by forecasting change into the future, we don't have to, have regrets, so to speak. We can look at, hey, if we make these policy choices, it may lead us in this direction. Do we like that direction or not? And maybe we want to go in a different direction and change our policy choices or move things around. And so by having, the ability to model the future, it gives us that a little bit of that 20/20 hindsight.
I like the framing there, and it reminds me of a cliche that I heard not too long ago. I was at a conference about preservation or something along those lines. It might have been Mark Conway. He's a council member in Baltimore City, but also really engaged in land preservation and so forth. And I remember, I think it was him dropped a one-liner that was like, the best time to plant a tree is 30 years ago, but the next best time is today. And I like that idea. Okay, if hindsight is 2020, let's gain whatever benefit we can from hindsight. Let's look at patterns of land use and development and things like tree cover and pervious surfaces and so forth, and try and use that as a foundation for what are we doing today and what are we thinking about tomorrow. So I like that. I like that framing a good deal. So like this is interesting stuff to me, and I'm far from being a practitioner. I'm sort of an Annapolis creature, and MACO as an organization tries to represent a really wide range of services that county governments either provide or partner with the state on. But it seems to me that this kind of information is useful at a number of different levels. So, I mean, you mentioned tree canopy. Can I start there and say, like, we've heard it just in the last few years, environmental groups advocating for let's plant 5 million trees across the state of Maryland. And we've had debates about refining and improving Maryland's forest conservation laws to basically say, you know, when you do some building and development that removes some tree cover, replace it, bank it. Let's find ways to keep those numbers, 1-to-1 or whatnot. So your data set seems like it would be custom made to help those policy debates go in the right direction. Is that fair?
Yes, that is fair. And that is something that the data enable us to do. We've mapped land use, land cover. So again, land cover is like tree canopy and impervious, and land use is like residential, commercial. We've mapped the combination of those things at 1 meter resolution with 56 different classes across 99,000 square miles, including the whole state of Delaware and Maryland, and a good portion of Virginia, Pennsylvania, pieces of parts of New York and West Virginia, and the whole District of Columbia. So it's a huge area that we've mapped at very fine resolution. And we've done that for the year 2013, 2017, and 2021. We're about to roll out with the 2021 data. And so what we can look at is not just what's there, but how it's changed in great detail. And one of the things that's changing that gets probably the most attention is tree canopy. So a lot of jurisdictions set goals, and the U.S. Forest Service and states, if we want to plant this many trees or we want to have this many acres of tree canopy, on the landscape. And those goals, up until recently have not taken into account kind of net changes in tree canopy. So basically, we do stuff and we track what we do. And we say, okay, have we reached our target of planting this many trees or this many acres? But meanwhile, other things are happening, phenomena happening, storms, people clearing trees, that interfere with electrical lines, or there's disease and that kills trees, or just people removing trees for development. All that's happening kind of as we're planting trees. And what we found with looking at these data over time is that net change is actually we're losing trees in communities and urban areas. We're losing tree canopy. So we're trying to make progress. A lot of people are doing a lot of good work and need to keep doing that work. But we, for the first time, have a perspective on kind of what we're up against, which is, we're also losing a lot of trees. So, we need to, double or triple our efforts to the extent we can, so that we actually have a net gain over time.
Right. I will say that my first thought when we talk about measuring and watching tree canopy cover is in sort of a rural area, right? There's going to be a development. We're going to put up new homes or new commercial development or whatnot. Part of that ends up knocking down, a row or a batch of trees and so forth, and then we lose some tree cover as a result of that, and that's sort of intuitive. But the notion of the built up areas of our state, the urban and suburban parts where we've already got a lot of cover and already have a lot of commercial activity, that tree cover in those areas remains really important for managing heat on the ground and quality of life and things of that nature, which are not as obvious to me. I remember we did a panel on this at a recent Mako conference, and I just remember being really kind of overwhelmed with how big of a difference tree canopy downtown can make for livability of a town or a city and a downtown area. So mapping that sort of stuff out makes a lot of sense as you think about land use and so forth. But we're in the business of trying to make our areas good places to work and live. And this kind of information seems like it ought to help drive those decisions, in a better direction. I like that.
And we've been working with the U.S. Forest Service, and they've been putting out tree canopy fact sheets for every county in the watershed, 205 counties. And these fact sheets, they're available online. We'll provide a link, as part of this podcast. But those fact sheets tell you the composition of tree canopy, how much is in forest, how much is in people's backyards, how much is like trees along the road. It tells you the composition of kind of the landscape and the tree canopy today, also how it's changing and what it's changing to, and the patterns, the spatial patterns of change. Those are provided for every county. We're working with the Forest Service to update them and also to provide them down to the municipal level. So those fact sheets are really valuable to kind of establish a baseline of what's happening and an understanding of the dynamics. And then that enables communities to set goals for, okay, if that's my baseline today, what might I strive to achieve, in the next 5 years, 10 years, et cetera.
Right. So another thing that you mentioned in talking about some of the information that you and your team and your colleagues and partners have been developing is sort of the difference between pervious and impervious surfaces. So tell me if I've got this right. Like at the superficial level, we're talking about whether like rainwater can realistically be absorbed, or does it just run off of a pervious surface is, we think of asphalt and so forth as a pervious surface where the water just runs off and maybe becomes a bigger concern for stormwater management or sediment and that sort of stuff. Is that basically what that difference is all about?
Yeah. So for any developed area, about impervious surfaces include roads, rooftops, parking lots, and for a developed area, basically your impervious surfaces are 30% or 30, a third of each of those. So a third of the impervious is roads, a third of the impervious is like buildings and rooftops, and a third is like parking lots and other, kind of impervious areas. And you got it exactly right. I mean, impervious surfaces mean they're impervious to the infiltration of water. And what that means is when it rains, the water runs off the surface very quickly, and it creates a flashiness, a high volume, high power stream flow, which erodes the stream banks, can erode the stream bottom. And not only that, but from the impervious surfaces, all the deposition of, nitrogen from the air, both wet and dry deposition, and other things like toxics get washed into, the stream system. You also have a change in temperature because impervious surfaces, particularly in the summer, are very hot and they warm that runoff. And so you get a spike in temperature. Whereas if the water was unable to infiltrate like through the ground and then into the groundwater, it creates, and then it upwells into the stream, that creates a cooling effect. So we've changed our streams, we've changed the temperature, the pH, the chemistry, and the flow regime. And the flow regime in particular is impacted by more impervious surfaces.
So it seems to me that there are a number of applications for this information for practitioners at the county government level. This is Mako, and nominally our members and many of our listeners are in and around county government. But I know that each county in Maryland has established sort of a watershed implementation plan to sort of corral their collective thinking about how to deal with stormwater and phosphorus, nitrogen and sediment and so forth that flow into the bay, and having a sense of what parts of your jurisdiction, your county, are pervious versus impervious, like, is important for understanding where do you make plans, where are you thinking more about buffers or things of that nature. It seems like that's core information that you would use to guide that kind of planning at the local level.
Yes, and some jurisdictions are using it currently, using our data to identify, where they have large areas of parking that could be repurposed to kind of redevelopment, higher density development, affordable housing. So one of the best things we can do to accommodate future growth is to redevelop areas and provide denser housing and affordable housing for the growing population. And there's no better environmental way to do that than through infill and redevelopment.
Right.
And so having the impervious surface data really helps with that.
Now, I know adaptive reuse is one of these topics that if we put it on the schedule at a Mako event, we will get a jam-packed room because there's lots of jurisdictions who I think are in that situation, that we've got retail space or parking lots or whatnot that could be repurposed. And as Maryland, we know, has a shortage of affordable and achievable housing and other sorts of infrastructure needs. The idea of finding good locations where you can repurpose land for something like that's a desirable growth and development is sort of a win-win opportunity. Everybody's enticed by those prospects, and having the information about what areas make sense seems like it just puts you in the best position to find a win there.
Agreed. Yes.
Yeah. And I guess on impervious versus pervious surfaces, this also I would have to think is relevant, as we have local jurisdictions. So many of our jurisdictions are right along the bay and right along effectively the sea level. But as you're thinking about coastal sustainability and resilience, I'd have to think that being aware of where the water's going to flow and where you're prone to overflow has to be part of your mapping out your points, your pressure points, where are the roads most likely to flood and so forth. You experience that, but also when you can map it, there's more behind. And now we need a strategy to get in and help restore this stream so it can carry the volume that it needs to, that sort of thing. I know we have a lot of counties in that game, but this information certainly seems like it helps put those resources to best use, right?
Right. And I've talked about the land use land cover data, and I think that's what kind of my group and my collaborators are probably best known for. But another data set that we'll be rolling out in the next couple of weeks, we call it hyper resolution hydrography. And this work has been led by Dr. Matt Baker at UMBC, working with the Chesapeake Conservancy and working with my team at USGS. And what this data set is, it's a very, very detailed data set of all the gullies, streams, ditches that exist in the watershed. Now, most people think, well, we have stream maps. Actually, we'll go to the US Geological Survey and we'll get their stream maps. The best stream maps we have for the nation currently have about twice as less, have a lot fewer streams, I forget the exact way to express it, than in this new data that we're rolling out. We have over 2 times the number of lines on our map than any map that exists. And what that shows is, at the local level, local government level, is it shows how connected the landscape is to waterways. if you look at just, large streams, you're like, oh, water just runs off the land and it travels through the landscape a long way before it gets to a stream. That's not reality. Water travels actually a fairly short way before it gets to a concentrated flow path, which could be a ditch or gully or something. And then it rapidly goes into the streams and then into the rivers and then into the bay. And so having, mapped all these features, what it enables local governments to intervene and be more effective and efficient in where they put best management practices and other things to, both control runoff and, reduce the volume of, from storm events and stuff, reduce flooding, manage flooding. It's very, very powerful information. And you couple that with the high resolution impervious, and you can do a lot in terms of targeting where you're going to intervene in the landscape so that you prevent flooding and some of these other detrimental effects of growth.
Right. So the deeper, more granular information we can get today, replaces an old, best available data set. I would have to imagine part of this is just the ability to, these days probably send up a drone and get overhead shots where, whatever, a generation ago, 15, 30 years ago, you had to fly an airplane every couple of years and schedule airtime and that sort of stuff. Things have to be easier to literally get up in the air and just start, taking pictures and do, visual mapping. Today's got to be easier to get down to that lower tier, right?
You would think. It's yes and no. I mean, technology is evolving. Drones are fantastic for, local area assessments, but, we're talking, maybe if you want to look at, a farm field or an individual kind of, 100 acre forest plot or something, then those drones are great. But, we don't have military style drones to fly the entire watershed or the entire state. And the data that my group produces in partnership with the Chesapeake Conservancy, University of Vermont, and others is data that we produce for 99,000 square miles. And so we have to rely on aerial imaging and we have to rely on satellites and, and we try to do that in as cost-effective means as possible. So LiDAR data from airplanes. So LiDAR is basically it's a radar. That shoots a beam down to the surface, and that beam bounces back, and they can tell where the ground is, the height of objects, the dimension of objects. It's very detailed information, and that has been collected for all the counties in Maryland. In some counties, it's been collected 3 or 4 times in the past decade. That enables us to even look at change. And it's with those LiDAR data that we can get at these gullies and ditches and streams. We can map that. We can map the height of forests, even the structure of forests and the height of buildings. It's super powerful data. It's expensive. It's time consuming to collect. We're hoping that, technologies are going to evolve to enable us to do this, quicker and cheaper. But basically, it's the drones aren't there yet in terms of replacing our ability to map all of Maryland.
That's even more, actually, I'm more intrigued by the data collection process now with that description and the technology being more complicated than just how do you get in the air with the camera, but using the more advanced stuff is interesting stuff. Gets beyond my expertise for sure, but that's good. That's what we want here. So I'm interested just generally. A lot of this, I think, lands if you're a practitioner who is in land use. You're in the county office of planning and zoning. You're working on the next comprehensive plan. Maybe you're involved in the environmental side, environmental protection, or working on things like part of the watershed implementation plan or stormwater management or stream restoration and so forth. All those applications seem pretty obvious. can I dial back and can you pitch a little bit about how some of this information might be of value to folks who are not hip deep in it already? If you're the county commissioner for a jurisdiction who's close to the Chesapeake Bay, or you're thinking about land use policy, but it's not exactly your day-to-day job, but it's just on your mind. You're in economic development or something along those lines. How do you feel like some of this information can have value beyond the folks who are already sort of in this lane?
Well, I think, and in this lane, I think we're talking about kind of, land use planners and updates to comprehensive plans, where I think the data have incredible utility for those purposes. And they have been used by Maryland Department of Planning already to inform their statewide land use map. So I guess that's the lane we're talking about. And, outside the lane, there's a lot of different interest groups that whether they're concerned about, wildlife habitat, whether they're concerned about, access to the bay or parks and the connectivity of parks and bike paths, rails to trails, things like that. When your concern or your interest is, where do I have something that I value in the county or in the state, and how is it connected to things, and do people have access to it? All those kinds of questions can be informed by having this, high resolution data, characterization of the landscape, and characterization of change over time. I mean, it's very empowering to be able to, not everyone, we all look out our windows when we drive down the road and we're like, oh, look, there's a new building there. There's a new Home Depot, or there's a new Acme or something. Mm-hmm. We all do that. But what we often don't do is we're not looking, our brains are thinking, oh, that happened and that happened and that happened. And the next thing you know, a lot has happened and a lot has changed. And by characterizing the landscape and change over time, we can, that information is kind of in your face. And you're like, oh, wow, there's been a lot of change here. There's a lot has happened, not just out my window of my car, but all over the place. And places I didn't even realize, or thought about before are changing. And that's really empowering, because then people can say like, oh, okay, is this, these things I didn't realize were happening, or the magnitude I didn't realize. And maybe I should play a role. Maybe I should get involved and participate, so we don't have as much change as we saw, or we have change that's different, that's, better planned, better managed. So I think it's very empowering to get people motivated to participate in the process. And, planning it's a democratic process. And I think for that reason, I think the data are super powerful, and they touch on, issues of, flooding and sea level rise and forest health. So, almost, it's hard for me to think of a group that wouldn't have some vested interest in at least looking at the information.
I like that framing a good deal. I mean, I feel like it is a core mission of a local elected official. That if you're on the town council, or if you're a county commissioner or council member, that you represent your constituents day to day, and you want to make sure that the library is providing good service, and that the pothole gets fixed and so forth. And some of it is really short-term transactional, but it also is your duty to be thinking about quality of life and what's going to happen next, and how do these things work together. And some of that is the professionals in land use planning and the sort of official process of adopting your zoning plan and that sort of stuff. But other parts of it are bringing all these pieces together, that your vision for economic development, and where do you place new infrastructure for water and sewer and other things like that, that these things ought to make sense holistically. And the sort of the ground game for that effort can really be guided by where, what's happening with the water, what's happening with the surface we have now, where are the trees, where's the natural infrastructure that you want to maintain or enhance, so that vision comes together more wisely. I think that's a stewardship job that's a little more subtle than fix that pothole today, but it's at least as important.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me ask, just while I've got you, I can't help but ask. We're all familiar with sort of the scientific method. You have a hypothesis, you go do a test, and you see whether it supports or refutes the hypothesis. Have you and your team ever come away with like genuine surprises or sidestep outcomes as a result of, we went and gathered the data here and it was not what we expected, or it pointed us in a different direction than we might have guessed? Is that something that happens in this kind of work?
Well, yes. And so I think the most surprising thing, having been mapping the landscape now with different technologies over the last 20 years, when I started my career, it was kind of the beginning of the housing boom. So what you saw was subdivisions everywhere, and developers, they couldn't build the houses fast enough. And so they, build 100 homes on spec, so they say, which is basically they're building them and then they'll build them all and then they'll sell them. And they don't do that anymore. That's not the way the economics works. So now the subdivisions are built almost home by home, and somebody has to buy the home and the lot and say, okay, build it then. So things are moving a lot slower now in that realm. But what we see in our data, which we didn't, it's obvious when you think about it in hindsight, but what's happening now is you have warehousing has boomed. And so when we see, if we look across the state and across the watershed, and where do we see kind of hot spots of development, it's warehouses, it's data centers. And particularly the biggest surprise was in Virginia, utility scale solar fields. And in Maryland, I think people are probably familiar with, you see, a small solar field, next to the police station or near the high school, or maybe in an agricultural field, you'll see, one or two fields that have been converted to solar, and they may be, 50 acres or something like that.
Right.
Well, in Virginia, there are thousands of acres, and a lot of those we see are in forested lands, and which we didn't expect to see at all. And we're like, whoa, that's interesting. And so our data were able to bring more attention to that issue than kind of it initially had, and kind of pop it up on people's radar. And so then the Chesapeake Bay Program convened a scientific conference to look at the hydrologic impacts of solar fields, and, working with the state of Virginia and others, on that work. So it's, you're constantly kind of checking the pulse of the landscape by mapping it. And we need to be, as mappers, we need to be prepared to change our classification, to morph the way we map based on the phenomena that we see. So we actually have a solar field class now. It's a big enough change, and we anticipate it growing even more so in the future, that it's one of our classes in our data set. And we would never have thought to add that as a class, 10 years ago. So that was one of the kind of, eyebrow raising things that's happened recently.
It's very relevant and timely in Maryland public policy as well. I think every reasonable forecast for what Maryland land use is going to look like over the next decade or so, we have an aggressive appetite for locally sourced clean energy, and converting agricultural land and other sort of relatively cheap land that's got good sunlight access to solar use is definitely going to be happening here. I don't know if this gets too deep beyond your expertise, but what ends up being the revised classification when you have an area that used to be in active agriculture and now becomes one of those large sort of utility scale solar sites? I mean, like even on the question of pervious versus impervious, does that become some sort of a middle ground if you have big sheets of silicon, but there's still soil beneath it and so forth?
Yes. So we have a class. We have two classes for solar. One is the panel arrays themselves, because they cover so much land. And the other is, and we call that kind of solar infrastructure. And the other one is the pervious lands. I kind of put that in quotes, pervious lands kind of between and around the panel arrays. And so out of this science workshop that we had on solar, where we brought in experts from universities and industry and others, basically what we learned is that there is a diverse array of management techniques applied to the development of solar fields. And some of them, the topsoil can be removed, the area is graded and compacted, and then the panel arrays are put in, and that can often lead to runoff issues, stormwater runoff problems. For other solar fields, there's kind of a lighter touch, if you will, on the landscape. Vegetation is established very quickly. It's dense, thick grasses, between the panel arrays. The panel arrays can be like tilted during storm events and stuff to increase infiltration. So there's a diverse array, and some of them act almost as impervious surfaces or partially impervious in terms of runoff, and others don't. And so it's a nascent industry, and it's evolving, and it needs to evolve such that there's people abide by certain practices that don't lead to problems later on.
So this is actually like hitting right in the center of a very live policy debate here in the state of Maryland over the approval of these large-scale solar sites and so forth. And that's probably a deeper and lengthier topic that we may explore another time on the podcast. But the connection here wasn't obvious to me, but once you started talking about it, my light bulb is flickering, really bright that this information, like you said, need to come up with a new classification in your mapping for this kind of land use, because it wasn't thousands of acres, a generation ago, but today and looking forward, it likely will be, and that'll be a bigger part of our planning for the next 10, 20, 30 years and so forth. So all makes sense. Okay, so I mean, let me wrap up with like a conventional something I didn't ask that you wanted to talk about, or you have sort of a home run thing to talk about that I just didn't tee up for you properly, but interested in our listeners would be interested in what else you got to sell, or what should you point us to if you've whet their appetite with today's conversation. Where can they go for more, or what else should they be thinking about?
Well, I think that I didn't talk a whole lot about kind of the forecasting work we do. We do work with the states to kind of forecast out what growth might look like 20, 30 years into the future. And one of the reasons why we do that is so that we can understand the benefits and quantify the benefits of planning and conservation. And so if you think of like two futures, and so we're in the year 2050, and what does that future look like if we develop denser, more affordable housing served by sewer with adequate road infrastructure and walkable communities, that type of thing, versus single home development on quarter acre, third acre lots. What if we conserve our stream corridors, our steep slopes, our valued wildlife habitats, our working forests and farms? What if we conserve those areas and prevent them from being converted, and we put solar fields, where they're more suitable on marginal agricultural land, perhaps, or on reclaimed mine lands? Those are like two different futures. And if you look at that and you map it out and model it, we can actually quantify what the difference in nutrient and sediment loads to the Chesapeake Bay are going to be, like the different levels of pollution from future A or future B. And that can help raise awareness and help stir up the conversation on, which future do we want? And we have a choice now. We always have a choice. And we always have a choice of which direction we want to go. And that choice is made almost on a daily basis. But you got to have a light. We have tunnels, and you have to have a light at the end of the tunnel to be like, okay, I want to go there and I want to keep heading in that direction. And that's what, the modeling tries to do. And we're the only, the Bay has a pollution diet. It's called a total maximum daily load, or TMDL. So that's the regulatory side of the Bay restoration effort. And there's like 40,000 TMDLs in the whole country. We're the only one that credits land conservation and land use planning on reducing nutrients and sediment to the Bay. And we're doing that because it's a long-term, large area restoration project that, takes decades to accomplish. And over that time, the population of the watershed is going to grow by a couple million, and changes are going to happen. Land conversions are going to happen. And we've got different futures that each state has developed of, here's one with a lot of planning and conservation, and here's one without. And they can get credit for all that planning and conservation, nutrient credit, that nowhere else in the nation can that happen. And that has to do with the data that we've developed over the years and the models we've developed, to give people confidence that, they can take credit for these activities.
Well, it's a great way to bring a number of these conversations together. You've got motivations as a local leader to try and do the right thing and have the various components of your longer term thinking connect with one another. But also there's some practical rewards and benefits as you strive toward reduction in nutrient loads going into the Chesapeake Bay. These are some tools that practically can go in the asset column toward reaching those goals. So even if you're not persuaded that smart planning is smart, you may find that this rewards just, we want to get to certain goals on a tally sheet. And Maryland has been smart enough to say these good practices are part of that effort and can help you get closer to those goals and maybe avoid some other things that would have been more costly or more difficult. So back to the plan ahead and reap the benefits. I think that's a good way to bring a bunch of this together. Peter Claggett, thanks so much for taking some time to talk with us on the Conduit Street podcast and our listeners. We will leave it there, and you've dropped a couple pieces of information. I will load up with your help with some information where our listeners can go and get more background and see some of those data sets and some of the county specific stuff. We'll put some show notes, comments along those lines. With that, we'll wrap up. I'll thank you all for listening to the Conduit Street podcast. If you like the episode, please go ahead and subscribe, and that way we will get every episode sent to the device of your choice. I'll thank this week for our production and arrangement help from producer Chantel Malcolm Lynn and our colleague Virginia White for bringing everything together. On behalf of the Conduit Street podcast, our guest Peter Claggett, this is Michael Sanderson signing out. We will talk to you soon.